Hi everyone, for today's book review we're going to be going back to the trenches on the Western Front of World War I, and we're going to be checking out the landships, in other words the tanks of the First World War, and in particular through this book, Craig Moore's Tank Hunter, the tanks of the First World War. This is a nifty little book. It is basically comprised of two halves. The first half is a guide through every tank that went into production during the First World War. And then the second half is a detailed selection of tank battles. Basically, all the battles, both major and minor, in which tanks were involved, including the first tank versus tank engagements, and even the tank versus tanks, where you had British Mark IVs going against captured British Mark IVs that were operated by the Germans. The Germans called these tanks Butpanzer, But being the German word for boot, as in war booty. I really like this book because it's a one-stop reference guide for the main tank models that were put into production. The tanks for the major countries are included. You've got the main ones, your standard rhomboid Mark IV 5s, male-female variants that had that quite distinctive World War I shape. There's of course the characteristic and my personal favorite, the German A7V Panzer, as well as the French Schneider's Saint-Chamond tanks, the American copy of the Renault FT light tank, and in a nice little touch there's also an entry regarding the crazy, eccentric and fantastically steampunk Russian Tsar tank, which you can see in this photo up here. In addition to a description of the tanks, we have plenty of side profile illustrations, not only of the tanks within the tank section itself, but then you also have a variety of illustrations depicting tanks in various paint schemes and layouts that were involved throughout the war. Some of them had the fascines, which was the reeds and the wood that were piled at the top of the tank to allow them to drop it and then cross over a trench. And you also have them as well in their German Butpanzer configuration. In addition to the history of the tanks and their battles in the first half of the book, you also get a rundown of the basic stats and specs of each tank. And critically, for those of you who have a soft spot for tanks in World War I and want to see an actual real tank, then at the end of each description of the tank, there's, if they're still around, a list of where some of the surviving tanks can be found. For example, the only A7V Panzer that is still around is actually tucked away in Queensland, in Brisbane, in Australia. It was brought over after it had been caught by Australian troops. The other Panzer tanks, A7Vs, are all replicas. Mephisto, which is the one genuine one, is tucked away in Queensland. And a sight to see for any of you who can get a chance to see it. It is quite a spectacular vehicle to view. The second half of this book is then looking at the variety of battles that were involved with the tanks, or rather that the tanks were involved in the battles. And while Craig writes in a fantastically clear and easy to follow manner, the one drawback that I find in this particular section is that there are no maps. There are no maps, no battle diagrams, nothing to indicate where these battles happened or how the battles transpired. That is one thing that would have elevated this book. Otherwise though, as a nifty reference guide, this is fantastic. It's quite a small book, but again, crammed full of information, easy to carry for those who, are going to, say, visit the Tank Museum in Bovington, or who are just completely interested in tanks and want one volume that covers all the major models of the First World War, then this book is a great reference for that. For all of that information, it absolutely deserves a 3 captain's hats. If a new edition comes out with more battle maps, particularly in that second section, that will elevate this book to another level. But, as I've said, as a reference guide to tanks of the First World War, this is a fantastic reference and a great starting off point, particularly if you were just getting interested in the armoured vehicles of the First World War. So there you have it. Tank Hunter World War I by Craig Moore. If you love tanks, do check it out.